Chapter 221 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3 by Peckett PREST. Chapter 221. The Night Watch, the Vault. It was each moment becoming a more difficult affair to carry on any conversation in the public-house parlour, for not only did the thunder each moment almost interrupt the speakers with its loud reverberations, but now and then such a tremendous gust of wind would sweep around the house that it would be quite impossible for anyone to make himself heard amidst its loud howling noise. These were circumstances, however, which greatly added, no doubt, in the getting up of a superstitious feeling in the minds of the people there assembled, which made them ripe for any proposition which perhaps in their soberer moments they would have regarded with considerable dismay. Hence, when the blacksmith rushed to the door crying, "Who will follow me to the old church and lay hold of the vampire?" about half a dozen of the boldest and most reckless, and be it told to their honour, if there be any honour in such an enterprise, which after all was a grossly selfish one, they were the worst characters in the village, started to their feet to accompany him thither. There are many persons who waver about an enterprise, who will join it when it has a show of force, and thus was it with this affair. The moment it was found that the blacksmith's proposition had some half-dozen stout adherents, he got as many more, some of whom joined him from curiosity, and some from dread of being thought to lack courage by their companions if they held off. There was now a sufficiently large party to make a respectable demonstration, and quite elated with his success, and caring little for the landstorm that was raging, the blacksmith, closely followed by the butcher, who had no objection in life to the affair, especially as he was at variance with the parson concerning the tithes of a little farm he kept, called out, to the church, and followed by the rabble, rushed forward in the direction of the sacred edifice. As the hour of 11 was struck, and as the reader is aware that at that hour Sir George Crofton and his two sons, accompanied by Mr. Bevan, had agreed to go to the church on their melancholy errand, we will leave the noisy brawlers of the alehouse for the purpose of detailing the proceedings of those whose fortunes we feel more closely interested in. The baronet was by no means wavering in his determination, notwithstanding it had been made at the time of unusual excitement, when second thoughts might have been allowed to step in and suggest some other course of proceeding. Now Mr. Bevan was not without his own private hopes that such would be the case, for what he dreaded above all things was the truth of the affair, and that Sir George would have the horror of discovering that there was much more in the popular superstition than, without ocular demonstration, he would have been inclined to admit. Although a man of education and of refined abilities, the evidence that had already showed itself to him of the existence at all events of some supernatural being with powers analogous to those of the fabled vampire was such that he could not wholly deny, without stultifying his intellect, that there might be such things. It is a sad circumstance when the mind is, as it were, compelled to receive undeniable evidence of a something which the judgment has the strongest general reasons for disputing, and that was precisely the position of Mr. Bevan, and the most unenviable it was. That night's proceedings, however, in the vault, he felt must put an end to all doubts and perplexity upon the subject, and so with a fervent hope that, in some at the present inexplicable manner, the thing would be found to be a delusion, he waited more anxiously the arrival of the Croftons at the parsonage. At 10:30 o'clock instead of 11, for as the evening advanced, Sir George Crofton had shown such an amount of nervousness that his sons had thought it would be better to bring him to the parsonage. They arrived, and Mr. Bevan perceived at once what a remarkable effect grief and anxiety had already had upon the features of the baronet. He was a different man to what, but a few days since, he had been, and more than ever the kind clergyman felt inclined to doubt the expediency of his being present on such an occasion, and yet how to prevent him, if he were really determined, was a matter of no small difficulty. "My dear friend," said Mr. Bevan, "will you pardon me if I make an effort now to persuade you to abandon this enterprise?" "I can pardon the effort easily," said Sir George Crofton, "because I know it is dictated by the best of motives, but I would fain be spared of it, for I am determined. I will say no more, but only with deep sincerity hope that you may return to your dwelling, each relieved from the load of anxiety that now oppresses you. I hope to heaven it may be so." "The night looks strange and still," said Charles, who wished to draw his father's attention as much as possible from too close a contemplation of the expedition on which they were bound. "It does," said Edwin. "I should not be surprised at a storm, for there is every indication of some disturbance of the elements." "Let it come," said Sir George, who fancied that in all those remarks he detected nothing but the wish to withdraw him from his enterprise. "Let it come. I have a duty to perform, and I will do it, though heaven's thunders should rock the very earth. The forked lightning is not launched at the father who goes to watch at the grave of his child." Charles and Edwin, upon finding that Sir George was in the mood to take a misapplication of whatever was said to him, desisted from further remarks, but left Mr. Bevan quietly to converse with him in a calm and unirritating manner. It was the object of the clergyman to put off as much time as possible before proceeding to the church, so that the period to be spent in the family vault of the Croftons should be lessened as much as possible, for he felt assured that each minute there wasted would be one of great agony to the bereaved father, who would feel himself once again in such close approximation to that daughter on whom he had placed some of his dearest affections. Sir George, however, defeated this intention by promptly rising when his watch told him that the hour of 11 had arrived, and it was in vain to attempt to stultify him into a belief that he was wrong as regarded the time, for the church was sufficiently near for him to hear the hour of 11 pealed forth from its ancient steeple. "Come," said Sir George, "the hour has arrived. I pray you do not delay. I know you are all anxious and fearful concerning me, but I have a spirit of resolution and firmness in this affair, which shall yet stand me in good stead. I shall not shrink as you imagine I shall shrink. Come, then, at once. It is suspense and delay which frets me, not action." These words enforced a better spirit into both his sons and Mr. Bevan, and in a few moments the party of four, surely sufficiently strong to overcome any unexpected obstacles, or to defeat any trickery that might be attempted to be passed off upon them, proceeded towards the church. It will be recollected that it was just a little after that time that the storm commenced, and, in fact, the first clap of thunder that seemed to shake the heavens took place just as they reached the old graveyard adjoining the sacred building. "There!" exclaimed Charles. "I thought that it would come." "What matter?" said Sir George. "Come on." "Humour him in everything," said Mr. Bevan. "It is madness now to contradict him. He will not recede under any circumstances." The natural senses of Sir George Crofton appeared to be preternaturally acute, for he turned sharply and said quickly but not unkindly, "No, he will not recede. Come on." After this, nothing was said until they reached the church door, and then, while Mr. Bevan was searching in his pockets for the little key which opened the small private entrance, some vivid flashes of lightning lit up with extraordinary brilliancy the old Gothic structure, the neighboring tombs, and the melancholy yew trees that waved their branches in the night air. Perhaps the delay which ensued before Mr. Bevan could find the key likewise arose from the wish to keep Sir George Crofton as short a time as possible within the vault. But he at length produced it, for any further delay could only be accounted for by saying that he had it not. The small arched doorway was speedily cleared, and as another peal of thunder broke overhead in an awful grandeur of sound, they entered the church. Mr. Bevan took the precaution this time to close the door, so that there could be no interruption from without. "Now, Sir George," he said, "remember your promise. You are to come away freely at the first dawn of day, and if nothing by then has occurred to strengthen this frightful supposition, which I suppose I may say we have all indulged in, I do hope that forever this subject will be erased from your recollection." "Be it so," said Sir George, "be it so." Mr. Bevan then busied himself in lighting a lantern, and from beneath one of the pews where they were hidden he procured a couple of crowbars, with which to raise the stone that covered the entrance of the vault. These preparations took up some little time, so that the old clock had chimed the 11:15 and must have been rapidly getting on to the half hour, before they stood in the aisle close to the vault. "This marble slab," said Sir George, as he cast his eyes upon it, "always hitherto has been cemented in its place. Why is it not so now?" "Is it not?" said Mr. Bevan. "No. Lend me the light." Mr. Bevan was averse to lending him the light, but he could not very well refuse it, and when Sir George Crofton had looked more minutely at the marble slab, he saw that it had been cemented, but that the cement was torn and broken away, as if some violence had been used for the purpose of opening the vault. But whether that violence came from within or without was a matter of conjecture. End of chapter 221. Recording by Ellie, June 2009. Chapter 222 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Peckett PREST, Chapter 222. The Madman, the Vampire. "What does this mean?" cried Sir Crofton excitedly. "Hush!" said Mr. Bevan. "I pray you be calm, sir. If you are to make any discovery that will give you peace of mind, rest assured it will not be made by violence." "You do not answer my question." "I cannot answer it. Remember that I know no more than you do, and that, like yourselves, I am an adventurer here, in search of the truth." Sir George said no more upon that head, but with clasped hands and downcast eyes he stood in silence, while his two sons, armed with the crowbars that Mr. Bevan had provided for the occasion, proceeded to lift up the marble slab, which covered the vault where lay the sisters' remains. The work was not one of great difficulty, for the slab was not very large, and as it was not cemented down, it yielded at once to the powerful leverage that was brought to play against it, and in a few minutes it was placed aside, and the yawning abyss appeared before them. "Oh, sir," said Mr. Bevan, "even now at this late hour, and when the proceedings have commenced, I pray you pause." "Pause?" cried Sir George Crofton passionately. "Pause for what?" "Disturb not the dead, and let them rest in peace. Absolve the mind from the dangerous and perhaps fatal fancies that possesses it. And let us say a prayer, and close again this entrance to the tomb." His sons hesitated, and they probably would have taken the clergyman's advice, but Sir George was firm. "No, sir," he said. "Already have I suffered much from coming thus far. I will not retreat until I have effected all my purpose. I swear it, by heaven, whose temple we are in now. You would not, Mr. Bevan, have me break such an oath." "I would not, but I regret you made it. Since, however, it must be so, and this rash adventure is determined upon, follow me. I will lead you the way into these calm regions, where you can sleep, I trust, in peace." Sir George Crofton made a step forward, and as he would have arrested Mr. Bevan's progress and led the way himself, but already the clergyman had descended several steps, so he had nothing to do but follow him. This they all did, Sir George going immediately after him, and his two sons, with pale anxious faces, as if they had a suspicion about the adventure would end in something terrific, came last, and they glanced nervously and suspiciously about them, but they said not a word, nor if they had spoken, it would have been to express great apprehension, and that was what they were ashamed to do. Mr. Bevan carried the light, and when he felt that he was at the bottom of the stone steps, by finding that he was treading upon the sawdust that was strewn on the floor of the vault, he turned and held the lamp up at arm's length, so that his companions might see their way down the steps. In another minute they all stood on the floor of the vault. The light burned with rather a faint and sickly glare, for so rapidly were noxious gases evolved in that receptacle for the dead, that notwithstanding it had been so frequently opened as it had been lately, they had again accumulated. In a few moments, however, this was partially remedied by the air from the church above, and the light burned still more brilliantly, indeed quite sufficiently so to enable them to look around them in the vault. Sir George Crofton's feelings at that moment must have been of the most painful and harrowing description. He had lived long enough to be a witness of the death and obsequies of many members of his family, whom he had loved fondly, and there he stood in that chamber of death, surrounded by all remains of those beings, the memory of whose appearance and voices came now freshly upon his mind. Mr. Bevan could well guess the nature of the sad thoughts that transpired in the breast of the baronet, and the sons, having by accident cast their eyes upon the coffin that contained the remains of their mother, regarded it in silence, while memory was busy too within them in conjuring up her image. "And it has come to this," said Sir George solemnly. "We all must come to this," interposed Mr. Bevan. "This is indeed a place for solemn and holy thoughts, for self-examination, for self-condemnation. But there is peace here, there is, the peace that shall be eternal. "What is that?" cried Charles. "The wind," said Mr. Bevan. "Nothing but the wind, howling around and through the old belfry. You will remember that it is a boisterous night." "Turn, turn, father." Sir George turned and looked at Charles, who pointed in silence to the coffin which contained the corpse of his mother. The light gleamed upon the plate on which was engraved her name. Sir George's features moved convulsively as he read it, and he turned aside to hide a sudden gush of emotion that came over him. After a few minutes he touched Mr. Bevan on the arm and said in a whisper, "Where did they place my child?" The clergyman pointed to the narrow shelf on which was the coffin of Clara Crofton, and then Sir George, making a great effort to overcome his feelings, said, "Mr. Bevan, our worthy minister and friend, and you likewise, my boys, hear me. You can guess to some extent, but not wholly, that can only be known by God, the agony that the sight of the poor remains of her who has gone from me in all the pride of her youth and beauty must be to me. Yet, now that I am here, I consider it to be my duty to look once again upon the face of my child, my lost Clara." "Oh, father, father," said Edwin, "forego this purpose." "You will spare us this," cried Charles. "Repent you, sir," said Mr. Bevan, "of the wish. Let her rest in peace. The dead are sanctified, but I am her father." "Nay, Sir George, let me implore you." "Implore me to what, sir? Not to look upon the face of my own child? Peace! It is no profanation for one who loved her as I loved her to look upon her once again. Urge me no more." "This is in vain," said Charles. "You are right, it is in vain." A shriek burst from the lips of Edwin at this moment, and flinging his arms around his father, he held him back. Mr. Bevan, too, gave a cry of terror, and Charles stood with his hands clasped, as if turned to stone. Their eyes were all bent upon Clara's coffin. The lid moved, and a strange sound was heard from within the receptacle for the dead. The clock of the old church struck 12. The coffin lid moved again, and then sliding on one side, it eventually fell upon the floor of the vault. The 4 spectators of this scene were struck speechless for the time with terror. Then they stood gazing at the coffin as if they were so many statues. And now the light, which Mr. Bevan still, for a miracle, held in his trembling grasp, shone on a mass of white clothing within the coffin, and in another moment that white clothing was observed to be in motion. Slowly the dead form that was there rose up, and they all saw the pale and ghastly face. A streak of blood was issuing from the mouth, and the eyes were open. Sir George Crofton lifted up both his hands and struck his head. Then he burst into a wild, frightful laugh. It was the laugh of insanity. Mr. Bevan dropped the light, and all was darkness. "Ha, ha, ha!" laughed Sir George Crofton. "Ha, ha, ha!" And the terrible laugh was taken up by many an echo in the old church, and responded to with strange and most unearthly reverberations. "Ha, ha, ha!" Oh, what a dreadful sound that was coming at such a time from the lips of the father! "Fly, Edwin, oh fly!" cried Charles. Edwin screamed twice, for he was full of horror, and then he fell on the floor of the vault in a state of insensibility. Charles had just sense left him to spring towards the steps, and made a frantic effort to reach the church. In his hurry he fell twice, but each time rising again with a shout of despair, he resumed his efforts, and all the while the horrible laugh of his maniac father sounded in his ears, a sound which he felt that he could never forget. By a great effort he reached the aisle of the church, and when there he called out, Mr. Bevan, help, oh help! For the love of God, speak! Help, help! Mr. Bevan, where are you? Speak, I implore you. Am I going mad? Oh yes, I shall, I must. What immortal intellect can stand such a scene as this? Help, help, oh help! The church was suddenly lit up by a flash of light, and turning in the direction from whence it proceeded, Charles saw Mr. Bevan approaching with a light, which he had procured from the chancel, and it would appear that immediately upon dropping in his horror the light in the vault, he had run up the stairs with the intent of getting another. "Who calls me? Who calls me?" he cried. I, said Charles. "Oh God, what a dreadful night this is!" The clergyman was trembling violently, and was very pale, but he made his way up to Charles, from whose brow the perspiration was falling in heavy drops, and then again they heard the mad Sir George laughing in the vault. "Ha, ha, ha! Oh God, is it not horrible?" said Charles. "Most horrible," responded Mr. Bevan. Bang, bang, bang. At this moment came a violent knocking at the church door, and then several voices were heard without shouting, "The vampire! The vampire! The vampire!" "What is that? What is that?" said Charles. "Nay, I know not," replied Mr. Bevan. I am nearly distracted already. Where is your brother? Did he not escape from the vault? Where is he? Oh, what a horrible laugh! Good God, that knocking too at the church door! What can be the meaning of it? Heaven in its mercy guide us now what to do. The reader will understand the meaning of the knocking, although those bewildered persons who heard it in the church did not. The fact is that the party from the alehouse, headed by the valiant blacksmith, and heated by the too liberal potations, had just arrived at the church, and were clamouring for admission. They had seen through one of the old pointed windows the reflection of the light which Mr. Bevan carried, and that it was that convinced them some one was there who might, if he would pay attention to uproarious summons. The knocking lasted with terrible effect, for the old door of the sacred edifice shook again. It seemed as if certainly it could not resist the making of such an attack. Mr. Bevan was confounded. A horrible suspicion came across him of what was meant by those violent demands for admission, and he shook with brutal trepidation as he conjectured what might be the effect of the proceedings of a lawless mob. "Now Heaven help us," he said, "for we shall soon, I fear, be powerless." "Good God, what mean you?" said Charles. "I scarcely know how to explain to you all my fears. They are too dreadful to think of. But while that knocking continues, what can I think?" "I understand. They call for my sister." "Oh, call her not by that name. Remember, and remember with a shudder, what she now is." End of chapter 222. Recording by Ellie. June 2009. Chapter 223 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3 by Peckett PREST. Chapter 223. The Hunt of the Vampire. All these occurrences, which had taken a considerable time in telling, occurred as simultaneously that although it would appear Mr. Bevan and Charles Crofton rather neglected Sir George and Edwin, who were still in the vault, they had not really had time to think of them, to say nothing of making any effort to extricate them from the frightful situation in which they were placed. Probably, after procuring a light, Mr. Bevan would have rushed to their rescue had not that incessant knocking at the church door suggested a new and more horrible danger still, from the evil passions of an infuriated multitude. "Oh, Mr. Charles," he said, "if you could but get your father away from the church, there is no knowing what an amount of misery he might be spared." "Misery, sir? Surely there is no more misery in store for us. Have we not suffered enough? More than enough. Oh, Mr. Bevan, we have fallen upon evil times, and I dread to think what will yet be the end of those most frightful transactions." The knocking at the church door continued violently, and Charles indicated a wish to proceed there to ascertain what it was. But Mr. Bevan stopped him, saying, "No, Charles, no. Let them be. I hardly think they will venture to break into the sacred edifice. But whether they do or not, remember that your duty and mine, yours being the duty of a son, and mine of a friend, should take us now to your father's vault." "That is true, sir," said Charles. "Lead on. I will follow you." Mr. Bevan, who had all the intellectual courage of a man of education and of regular habits, led the way again to the vault, with the light in his hand. It was a great relief that the insane and horrible laugh of Sir George Crofton had ceased. The best friend of any man could almost have wished him dead, where their ears had drunk in such horrible sounds. The shouts and cries from without now became incessant, and it seemed as if some weapon had been procured, wherewith to hammer violently upon the church door, for the strokes were regular and incessant, and it was evident that if they continued long, that frail defence against the incursions of the rebel rout without must soon give way. The only effect, however, which these sounds had upon Mr. Bevan was to make him hasten his progress towards the vault, for anything in the shape of a collision between those who wanted to take the church by storm and Sir George Crofton was indeed most highly to be deprecated. The steps were not many in number, and once again the clergyman and Charles Crofton stood upon the sawdust that covered the flooring of the vault. At first, in consequence of the flaring of the light, the state of affairs in that dismal region could not be ascertained, but as soon as they could get a view, they found Sir George lying apparently in a state of insensibility across the coffin of his daughter Clara, while Edwin was in a swoon close to his feet. Sir George," cried Mr. Bevan, "arouse yourself. It is necessary that you leave this place at once." The baronet got up and glanced at the intruders. Giles uttered a deep groan, for the most superficial observation of his father's face was sufficient to convince him that reason had fled, and that wildness had set up his wild domination in his brain. "Father, father," he cried, "speak to me, and dissipate the frightful thought." "What would you have of me?" said Sir George. "I am a vampire, and this is my tomb. You should see me in the rays of the cold moon gliding twixt earth and heaven, and panting for a victim. I am a vampire." At this moment Edwin seemed to be partially recovering, for his eyes opened as he lay upon the floor, and he looked around him with a bewildered gaze, which soon settled into more of intelligence as memory resumed her sway, and he recollected the various circumstances that had brought him into his present position. "Rouse yourself, Edwin, rouse yourself!" cried Mr. Bevan. "You must aid us to remove your father." "Do you talk of me?" said Sir George. "Know you not that I am one of those supernatural existences known as the death and despair dealing vampires? It is time I took my nightly prowl and look for victims. I must have blood. I must have blood." "Gracious heaven, he raves!" said Giles. "Heed him not," said Mr. Bevan. "Heed him not, and touch him not, so that he leave the place. When we have him once clear of the church, we can procure assistance, and take him to his own home." "Edwin," whispered Giles, "what of our sister?" Edwin shook his head and shuddered. "I know nothing but that I saw her. Oh, horrible sight, rising from her coffin! And then, in a convulsion of terror, my senses fled. A frightful ringing laugh came to my ears, and from that time till now, be the period long or short, I have been blessed by a death-like trance." "Blessed indeed," said Mr. Bevan. "Tarry one moment." Sir George Crofton was ascending the steps of the vault, but his two sons paused for an instant at the request of Mr. Bevan, and then the latter, approaching Clara's coffin, slightly removed the lid, and was gratified, as far as any feeling could be considered gratification under such circumstances, to find that the corpse occupied an ordinary position in its narrow resting place. "All's right," he said. "Let us persuade ourselves that this too has been but a dream, that we have been deceived, and that imagination has played us tricks it is accustomed to play to those who give it the rein at such hours as these. Let us think and believe anything rather than that what we have seen tonight is real." As he spoke these words, he ascended hastily the steps in pursuit of Sir George, who by this time alone reached the aisle. The heavy strokes against the door of the church had ceased, but an odd sort of scraping, rattling sound at the clock convinced the clergyman that the workman of more skill than he who had wielded the hammer was now at work, endeavoring to force an entrance. "Oh, if we could get but out," he said, "by the small private entrance, all might be well. Giles, urge your father, I pray you." Giles did so to the best of his ability, but the blacksmith, who had originally inched the crowd to attack the church in order to get possession of the body of the vampire, had sent to his workshop for the tools of his craft, and soon quietly accomplished by skill what brute force would have been a long time about, namely the opening of the church door. It was flung wide open before Sir George Crofton and his son could reach the small private entrance to which Mr. Bevan had the key. The sight of the multitude of persons, for they looked such crowds in the church porch, materially increased the incipient sadness of the bereaved father. End of chapter 223. Recording by Ellie. June 2009. Chapter 224 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Ellie. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Peckett PREST. Chapter 224. The Fate of Sir George. The Crossroad. Sir George, when he saw the crowd of persons, seemed to have some undefined idea that they were enemies. But this would not have been productive of any serious consequences if it had not most unfortunately happened that the most formidable weapon was within his grasp. The weapon consisted of one of the long iron crowbars which had been successfully used by his own sons in order to force a passage to the family vault, where such horrors had been witnessed. Suddenly then, seizing this weapon, which in the hands of a ferocious man was a most awful one, he swung it once around his head, and then rushed upon those he considered his foes. He dealt but 3 blows, and at each of those one of the assailants fell lifeless in the church porch. To resist or to attempt to contend with a man so armed and apparently possessed of such preternatural strength was what some of the party wished, and accordingly a free passage was left, and he rushed out of the church into the night air, shouting for vengeance, and still at intervals accusing himself of being a vampire. A most dangerous theme to touch upon, considering then the state of feeling in that little district. Anxiety for the safety of Sir George induced his sons and Mr. Bevan to rush after him, regardless of all other consequences, so that the church, the vaults, and everything they contained were left to the mercy of a mob infuriated by superstition, rendered still more desperate by the loss of 3 of the number in so sudden and exampled a manner. They opposed no obstacle to the leaving of those persons, who thus for dearer considerations abandoned the old church, but they rushed with wild shouts and gesticulations into the building. The vampire, cried the blacksmith. Death to the vampire, death and destruction to the vampire. Hooray, cried another. To the vaults, this way to Sir George Crofton's vault. There seemed to be little doubt now that this disorderly rebel would execute summary vengeance upon the supposed nocturnal disturber of the peace of the district. Ever and anon, too, as these shouts of discord and of threatening vengeance rose upon the night air, there would come a distant muttering of thunder, for the storm had not yet ceased, although its worst fury had certainly passed away. Dark and heavy clouds were sweeping up from the horizon, and it seemed to be tolerably evident that some heavy deluge of rain would eventually settle the fury of the elements, and reconcile the discord of wind and electricity. Several of the rioters were provided with links and matches, so that in a few moments the whole interior of the church was brilliantly illuminated, while at the same time it presented a grotesque appearance, in consequence of the unsteady and wavering flames from the links, through myriads of dancing shadows upon the walls. There would have been no difficulty under any ordinary circumstances in finding the entrance to the vault, where the dead of the Crofton family should have lain in peace. But now, since the large flagstone that covered the entrance to that receptacle of the grave was removed, it met the observation at once. It was strange now to perceive how, for a moment, superstition having led them so far, the same feeling should induce them to pause, where they ventured to make their way down these gloomy steps. It was a critical moment, and probably if any one or two had taken a sudden panic, the whole party might have left the church with precipitation, having done a considerable amount of mischief, and yet, as it is so usual with rioters, having left the principal object unaccomplished. The blacksmith put an end to this state of indecision, for, seizing a link from the man who was nearest him, he darted down the steps, exclaiming as he did so, "Who's afraid need not follow me." This was a taunt they were not exactly prepared to submit to, and the consequence was that in a very few moments the ancient and time-honored vault of the Croftons was more full of the living than of the dead. The blacksmith laid his hand upon Clara's coffin. "Here it is," he said. "I know the very pattern of the clothes and the fashion of the nails. I saw it at Grinken's, the undertaker's, before it was taken to the Grange." "Is she there? Is she there?" cried half a dozen voices at once. Even the blacksmith hesitated a moment. He removed the lid from the receptacle of the death, but when he did so, and his eyes fell upon the face of the presumed vampire, he seemed rejoiced to find in the appearances then exhibited some sort of justification for the act of violence of which already he had been the instigator. "Here you are," he said. "Look at the bloom upon her lips. Why, her cheeks are fresher and rosier than ever they were while she was alive. A vampire, my mates. This is a vampire. Or may I never break bread again. And now what's to be done?" Burn her, cried several. "Well," said the blacksmith, "mind, it's as you like. I brought you here, and shown you what it is, and now you can do what you like, and of course I'll lend you a hand to do it." Any one who had been very speculative in this affair might have detected in these last words of the blacksmith something like an inclination to creep out of the future consequences of what might next to be done, while at the same time shame deterred him from exactly leaving his companions in the church. After some suggestions then and some argumentation as to the probability or possibility of interruption, the coffin itself was, with its sad and wretched occupant, lifted from the niche, where it should have remained until that awful day when all the dead shall rise for judgment, and carried up the steps into the graveyard. But scarcely had they done so, when the surcharged clouds burst over their heads, and the rain came down in perfect torrents. The deluge was so frightful and continuous a character that they shrank back again beneath the shelter of the church porch, and there waited until its first fury had passed away. Such an even down storm seldom lasts long in our climate, and the consequence was that in about 10 minutes the shower had so far subsided that although the continuous rain was falling, it bore but a very distant comparison to what had taken place. "How are we to burn the body on such a night as this?" "Ay, how indeed," said another. "You could not so much as kindle a fire, and if you did, it would not live many minutes." "I'll tell you what to do at once," said one, who had as yet borne but a quiet part in the proceedings. "I'll tell you what to do at once, for I saw it done myself. A vampire is quite as secure buried in a crossroad, with a stake through its body, as if you burned it in all the fires in the world. Come on, the rain won't hinder you doing that." This was a suggestion highly approved of, and the more so as there was a crossroad close at hand, so that the deed would be done quick, and the parties dispersed to their respective homes, for already the exertion they had taken and the rain that had fallen had had a great effect in sobering them, and even now the perilous and disgusting operation of destroying the body by fire or any other way might have been abandoned, had any of the party suggested such a course. But the dread of a future imputation of cowardice kept all silent. Once more the coffin was raised by 4 of the throng and carried through the churchyard, which was now running in many little rivulets, in consequence of the rain. The crossroad was not above a quarter of a mile from the spot, and while those who were disengaged from carrying the body were hurrying away to get spades and mattocks, the others walked through the rain and finally paused at the place they thought suitable for that ancient superstitious rite, which it was thought would make the vampire rest in peace. It was hard to suppose that Sir George Crofton, his sons, and Mr. Bevan were all deceived concerning the symptoms of vitality which they had observed in the corpse of Clara. But certainly now there was no appearance of anything of the kind, and the only suspicious circumstances appeared to be the blood upon her lips, and the very flesh-like appearance of the face. If it were really a fact that the attack of Varney the vampire upon this fair young girl had converted her into one of those frightful existences, and that she had been about to leave her tomb for the purpose of seeking a repast of blood, it would appear that the intention had been checked and frustrated by the presence of Sir George and his party in the vault. At last a dozen men now arrived, well armed with spades and picks, and they commenced the work of digging a deep rather than a capacious grave in silence. A gloomy and apprehensive spirit seemed to come over the whole assemblage, and the probability is that this was chiefly owing to the fact that they now encountered no opposition, and that they were permitted unimpeded to accomplish a purpose which had never yet been attempted within the memory of any of the inhabitants of the place. The grave was dug, and about 2 feet depth of soil was thrown in a huge mound upon the surface. The coffin was lowered, and there lay the corpse, within the receptacle of poor humanity, unimprisoned by any lid, for that had been left in the vault, and awaiting the doom which had been decreed upon it, but which they now, with a shuddering horror, shrunk from performing. A hedge stake with a sharp point had been procured, and those who held it looked around them with terrified countenances, while the few links that had not been extinguished by the rain shed a strange and lurid glare upon all objects. "It must be done," said the blacksmith. "Don't let it be said that we got thus far and then were afraid." "Do it then yourself," said the man that held the stake. "I dare not." "I do," cried several voices. "You brought us here. Why don't you do it? Are you afraid after all your boasting?" "Afraid? Afraid of the dead? I'm not afraid of any of you that are alive, and it's not likely I'm going to be afraid of a dead body. You're a pretty set of cowards. I got no animosity against the girl, but I want that we shall all sleep in peace, and that our wives and children should not be disturbed nocturnally in their blessed repose. I'll do it if none of you'll do it, and then you may thank me afterwards for the act, although I suppose if I get into trouble I shall have you all turn tail upon me." "No, we won't. No, we won't." "Well, well, here goes. Whether you do or I'll do it directly." "He shrinks," cried one. "No," said another, "he'll do it." "Now for it. Stand aside." "Stand aside yourself." "Do you want to fall into the grave?" The blacksmith shuddered as he held the stake in an attitude to pierce the body, and even up to that moment it seemed to be a doubtful case whether he would be able to accomplish his purpose or not. At length, when they all thought he was upon the point of abandoning his design and cast the stake away, he thrust it with tremendous force through the body and the back of the coffin. The eyes of the corpse opened wide, her hands clenched, and a shrill, piercing shriek came from her lips. The shriek was answered by as many as there were persons present. and then, with pallid fear upon their countenances, they rushed headlong from the spot. End of chapter 224. Recording by Ellie, June 2009.
Chapter 226 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3 by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 226. The Strange Guest, the Little Chapel, Varney's Narrative. Mr. Bevan could not but see that he had made some impression, even upon the obdurate heart of Varney, and he was determined to follow that impression up by every means in his power. "Always have in mind," he said, "that by trusting me you trust one who is not in the habit of condemning his fellows. You will be safe from anything like sanctified reproach; for, to my thinking, religion should be a principle of love and tenderness, and not a subject upon which people who, perhaps, are themselves liable and obnoxious to all sorts of reproach, should deal forth denunciations against their neighbors. Is that indeed your faith?" "It is, and it is the real faith, taught by my great master. You are as one among many thousands. Nay, you may have been unfortunate in meeting with bad specimens of those who are devoted in the priesthood. Do not condemn hastily." "Hastily! I have been some hundreds of years in condemning. You will come with me." "I will, for once again, put faith in human nature." "Tell me, then, before we leave this spot, if you know aught of what has happened to, or become of the body of Clara Croton." "I can tell you it was left here buried, but uncovered." "Indeed, the ground is level, and I see no trace of a grave." "No, I have obliterated all such traces. I have placed the earth upon her. May she now rest in peace. Oh, that such a flower should have been so rudely plucked, and I the cause! Is not that enough to make heaven's angels mutiny if I should essay to pass the golden gates? Say no more of that. I thank God that the body is so disposed of, and that it will not come in the way of any of the Crofton family. This affair had far better now be let sink into oblivion. Alas! Poor Sir George is now the most pitiable sufferer. Indeed! Yes, madness has seized upon him. He only sits and smiles to himself, weaving in his imagination strange fancies. And you call that unhappy? It is called, and considered so. Oh, fatal error! He is happy. Reason, boasted, godlike reason! What are you but the curse of poor humanity? The maniac who will in his cell fancy it a gorgeous hall, and of the damp straw that is his couch make up a glittering coronet, is a king indeed, and most happy." "That is poetical," said Mr. Bevan, "if not true." "It is true." "Well, well, we will talk on that as well as other themes at our leisure. Come on, and I will at once take you to my home, where you will be safe, and I hope more happy. Are you not afraid?" "I am not." "You are right. Confidence is safety. Lead on, sir. I'll follow you, although I little thought to make any human companionship to-night." Mr. Bevan walked only about a step in advance as they proceeded toward the parsonage house, and on the way he conversed with Varney with calmness which, considering the very peculiar circumstances, few men could have brought to bear upon the occasion. But Mr. Bevan was no common man. He looked upon nature and all the living creatures that make up its vital portion with peculiar eyes, and if the bishop of his diocese had known one half of what Mr. Bevan thought, he would not have suffered him to remain in his religious situation. But he kept the mass of his liberal opinions to himself, although he always acted upon them, and a man more completely free from sectarian dogmas and illiberal fancies of superstition, which are nicknamed faith, could not be. There was still, notwithstanding all the circumstances, a hope lingering in his mind that Varney might, after all, not be even what he thought himself to be, but some enthusiast who had dreamt himself into a belief of his own horrible powers. We know that such was not the case, but it was natural enough for Mr. Bevan to hold as long as he could by such an idea. And so those two most strangely assorted beings, the clergyman and the vampire, walked together towards the pretty and picturesque dwelling of the former. "The distance is short," said Mr. Bevan. "Nay, that matters not," replied Varney. "I spoke because I thought you seemed fatigued." "No, my frame is of iron. My heart is bowed down with many griefs, but the physical structure knows no feeling of dejection. The life I possess is no common one. Oh, would that it were so, that I might shuffle it off as ordinary men can do!" "Do not say that. Who knows but that after all your living accomplishes better things?" "I cannot say that it accomplishes aught completely but one thing." "And that is my most exquisite misery." "Even that may pass away. But here we are at my little garden gate. Come in and fear nothing; for if you will seek Heaven as I would wish you, you will find this place such a haven of peace, and such a refuge against the storms of life, as you hardly fancied existed, I dare say, in this world." "Not for me. I did not fancy that there existed a spot on earth on which I could lie down in peace, and yet it may be here." End of chapter 226. Chapter 227 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 227. Varney opens the vast storehouse of his memory. A more singular conversation than that which took place between Varney the Vampire and this minister of religion could not be conceived. If there was any one particle of goodness existing in Varney's disposition, we may suspect it would now be developed. Perhaps the whole domestic history of the world never yet exhibited so remarkable an association as that between Mr. Bevan and Varney. And when they sat down together in the little cheerful study of the former, never had four walls enclosed two beings of the same species, and yet of such opposite pursuits. But we can hardly call Varney the Vampire human. His space of existence had been lengthened out beyond the ordinary routine of human existence, and the kind of vitality that he now enjoyed, if one might be allowed the expression, was something distinct and peculiar. It speaks volumes, however, for the philanthropy and liberality of the minister of any religion who could hold out the hand of fellowship to so revolting and to so horrible an existence. But Mr. Bevan was no common man. His religion was doctrinal, certainly, but it was free from bigotry, and his charity to the feelings, opinions, and prejudices of others was immense. He was accustomed to say, "May not my feelings be prejudices?" And one of the sublimest precepts of the whole Scriptures was to him that which says, "Judge not, lest ye too should be judged." Hence it was that he would not allow himself to revolt at Varney. It had seemed right to the great Creator of all things that there should be such a being, and therefore he, Mr. Bevan, would neither question nor condemn it. "Look about you," he said to Varney, with a disordered gaze. "You seem to look very about you, as if there was a danger in the atmosphere you breathe. But be assured you are safe here. It shall be my life for your life, if any harm should be attempted to be done you." Varney looked at him for a few moments' silence, and then in his deep and sepulchral voice he spoke, saying, "My race is run." "What mean you by that expression?" "I mean I shall no longer be a terror to the weak, nor a curiosity to the strong. In time past, more than once I have tried to shuffle off the evil of this frightful existence. But some accident, strange, wild, and wonderful, has brought me back to life again." "Perhaps not an accident," said Mr. Bevan. "You may be right. But when I have sought to rid the world of my own bad company, I have been moved to do so by some act of kindness and consideration, most contrary to my deserts. And then again, when I have been cast back by the waves of fate upon the shores of existence, my heart is burdened, and I have begun to plan to work mischief and misery and woe to all. I can understand how your feelings have alternated, but I hope that our association will have better result." Yes, a better result, for with consummate art, with cool perseverance, and extended knowledge, I trust I may think of some things which cannot fail of changing this living frame to that dust from which it sprung, and to which it should long since have returned. You believe in that? But do you not think there is a pure spirit that will yet live, independent of the groveling earth? There are times when I have hoped that even that fable were true. But you have promised me rest. Will you keep your word?" "That I will most certainly. But will you keep yours? You have promised me some details of your extraordinary existence, and as a divine, and I hope in some degree as a philosopher, I look for them with some degree of anxiety." "You shall have them. Leave me pens, ink, and paper, and in the solitude of this room until to-morrow morning, and you shall have what I believe to be the origin of this most horrible career. Your wishes shall be consulted, but will you not take refreshment?" "Nothing, nothing. My refreshment is one I need not name to you; and when forced by the world's customs and considerations of my own safety, I have partaken of man's usual food, it has but ill accorded with my preternatural existence. I eat not, drink not, here. You know me as I am." As he continued speaking, Varney evidently grew weaker, and Mr. Bevan could scarcely persuade himself that it was not through actual want of nourishment; but the Vampire assured him it was not so, and that rest would recruit him, to which opinion, as the experience of human nature generally afforded no index to Varney's peculiar habits, he was forced to subscribe. There was a couch in the room, and upon that Varney laid himself; and as he seemed indisposed for further conversation, Mr. Bevan left him, promising to return to him, as he himself requested, in the morning, with the hope of finding that he had completed some sort of narrative to the effect mentioned. It can scarcely be said that Mr. Bevan had thoroughly made up his mind to leave his guest for so long a period, and as there was a window that looked from the study in his little garden, he thought that by now and then peeping in, to see that all was right, he could scarcely be considered as breaking faith with his mysterious guest. "He will surely attempt nothing against his own life," thought Mr. Bevan, "for already he seems to be impressed with the futility of such an attempt, and to think that when he has made them he has been made the sport of circumstances that had forced him back to life again, despite all his wishes to the contrary." Mr. Bevan reasoned thus, but he knew little what was passing in the mind of Varney the Vampire. After about 2 hours more, when the night was profoundly dark, the liberal-minded but anxious clergyman went into his garden for the purpose of peeping into his study, and he then saw, as he supposed, his visitor lying enveloped in his large brown cloak, lying upon the couch. He was better pleased to see he was sleeping, and recovering from the great fatigue of which he complained, instead of writing, although that writing promised to be of so interesting a character, and he crept softly away for fear of awakening him. The hour had now arrived at which Mr. Bevan usually retired to rest, but he delayed doing so, and let 2 hours more elapse, after which he again stole out of his garden and peeped into the study. There lay the long, gaunt, slumbering figure upon the couch. "I am satisfied," said Mr. Bevan to himself. "Fatigue has completely overcome him, and he will sleep till morning now. I long much to become acquainted with his strange, eventful history." After this, Mr. Bevan retired to rest, but not until in prayer he had offered up his thanks, and stated his hopes of being able to turn aside from the wicked path he had been pursuing the wretched man who at that moment was slumbering peacefully beneath his roof. We should have less of opposition to churchmen if they were all like Mr. Bevan, and not the wily, ravenous, illiberal, grasping crew they really are. There was no priestcraft in him. He was almost enough to make one in love with his doctrines, be they what they might, so that they were his. Although we say that he retired to rest, we should more properly say he retired to try to rest, for after all there were feelings of excitement and anxiety about him which he could not repress wholly, and although he had every reason to believe his guest was sleeping, and calmly sleeping too, yet he found he was becoming painfully alive to the slightest sound. He became nervously alive to the least interruption, and kept fancying that he heard the slightest indications of movements in the house, such as at any other time he would have paid no attention to. It always happened, too, provokingly, that just as he was dropping into a slight slumber, that he thought he heard one of these noises, and then he would start awake and sit up in his bed and listen attentively until tired nature forced him to repose again. Those who have passed such a night of watchfulness need not be told how very, very exciting it becomes, and hour after hour becomes more intense and acute, and the power of escaping its fell influence less and less. Indeed, it was not until the dawn of morning that Mr. Bevan tasted the sweets of sound repose. Then, as is generally usual after nights of fever and disquietude, the cool, pure, life-giving air of early morn produced quite a different state of feeling, and his repose was calm and serene. End of chapter 227. Chapter 228 of Varney the Vampire, Volume 3. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by Julie Bynum. Varney the Vampire, Volume 3, by Thomas Peckett PREST. Chapter 228. The Flight of the Vampire. The Mass. As was to be expected, in consequence of the sleepless state in which he had been in the early part of the night, Mr. Bevan did not awaken at his usually early hour; and as his confidential servant had stolen into his room upon tiptoe, and seen that he was sleeping quietly and soundly, she did not think proper to disturb him. An autumnal sun was gleaming into his lattice window when he spontaneously awoke, and the reflection of the sunlight upon a particular portion of the wall convinced him that it was late. For a moment or two he lay in that dreamy state when we are just conscious of where we are, without having the smallest pretensions to another idea, and probably he would have dropped asleep again had it not been that his servant again opened the door, the lock of which had the infirmity of giving a peculiar snap every time it was used, and that thoroughly awakened him. "Oh, you are awake, sir?" said his old servant. "I never knew you sleep so long. Breakfast has been ready an hour and a half. It's a cool morning, sir, and what's worse, I can't get into your study to light you a bit of fire, which I thought you would want." The interruption altogether, and the mention of the study, served completely to arouse Mr. Bevan to a remembrance of the events of the preceding evening, and he cried, "What's the time? What's the time?" "It's after 9, and as for the study—" "Never mind the study, never mind the study. I will be down directly." Scarcely ever had Mr. Bevan dressed himself with such precipitation as he now did. How provoking, he thought, that upon this particular occasion, when I should like to have been up and stirring earlier than usual, I am a good hour and a half later. It can't be helped, though, and if my guest of last night is to be credited, he won't be waiting for his breakfast. The simple toilet of the kind-hearted clergyman was soon completed, and then he ran downstairs to the lower part of his house, and finding that his servant was in the kitchen, he thought he might at once proceed to his study to speak to the extraordinary inmate. He had furnished Varney with the means of locking himself in for the night, and it would seem that the Vampire had fully availed himself of those means, for when Mr. Bevan tried the door, he found himself as much at fault as his servant had been, and could not by any means effect an admittance. "He said his fatigue was great," remarked Mr. Bevan, "and so it seems it was, for surely he is yet sleeping. It is a comfort when one oversleeps oneself that the necessity for one's rising has been put off by the same means." Unwilling to disturb Varney, and not hearing from the slightest movement from within that he had yet done so, Mr. Bevan went to his breakfast, much better satisfied than he had been a quarter of an hour since; and as the breakfast-room adjoined the study, he had every opportunity, if the Vampire should be stirring, of hearing and attending to him. Not above 10 minutes elapsed in this kind of way when Mr. Bevan, although he saw nothing of his guest, heard something of the approach of a visitor by the trampling of feet upon the gravel walk, and upon looking through the window he saw that it was his friend Sir George Crofton from the Hall. It was rather an early hour for visitors, but still, under the peculiar circumstances, Sir George might be supposed not to stand upon ceremony in calling upon the clergyman of his parish and upon his old friend, combining, as Mr. Bevan did, both these characters in one. It was rather, though, placing the clergyman in a situation of difficulty, for while there was nothing he so much hated as mystery and concealment, he yet could not, upon the spur of the moment, decide whether he ought to inform Sir George of the presence of Varney or not. After the frightful manner in which the Baronet and his family had suffered from what might be called the machinations of the Vampire, it could scarcely be supposed that his feelings were otherwise than in a most exasperated state, and it might, for all he knew, be actually dangerous for the personal safety of that guest whom he had pledged his honor to protect, to allow Sir George Crofton to know at all that he was beneath his roof. While he was engaged in these considerations, and before he could come to anything like a conclusion concerning them, Sir George was announced and shown as a privileged visitor into the parlor. We cannot but pause to make a remark upon the stupendous change that had taken place in the appearance of that unhappy man. When first we presented him to the reader, he was as good a specimen of the hale, hearty English gentleman as we could wish to see. Good humor and good health beamed forth on every feature of his face, and well they might do so, for although the past had not been uncheckered by trials, the future wore to him a sunny aspect, and some of the feelings of his youth were returning to him in the happiness of his children. But what a change was now! 20 years of ordinary existence, with extraordinary vicissitudes, would scarcely have produced the effect that the events of the last fortnight had upon that unhappy father. He appeared to be absolutely sinking into the grave with grief, and not only was his countenance strangely altered, but the tones of his voice were completely changed from what they had been. Alas! Poor Sir George Crofton, never will the light of joy again illumine your face. There are griefs, inevitable griefs, which time will heal, griefs which, the more we look upon them, the more we find our reason array itself against them. But his sorrows were of a different complexion, and were apt to grow more gigantic from thought. "Good morning, Mr. Bevan," he said. "I am an early visitor, sir." "Not more early than welcome, Sir George. I pray you to be seated." "You are very good," said the Baronet. "But when one comes at an hour like this, I am of opinion that he ought to come with something like a good excuse for his intrusion." "There is none needed, I assure you. But I have been thinking upon the advice which you have given me, Mr. Bevan, to leave this part of the country, and try the endeavor by the excitement and changes of foreign travel to lessen the weight of my calamities. I think your determination is a good one, Sir George. Probably it is the best I could adopt, but I must confess that I should set about it in better spirit, but I am haunted by apprehensions." "Apprehensions, Sir George? Is not the worst past?" "It may be, and I hope to heaven it is, but I have another child, another daughter, fair and beautiful as my lost Clara. But what security have I that that dreadful being may not pursue her, and with frightful vindictiveness drive her to the grave?" Mr. Bevan was silent 2 or 3 minutes, and the idea crossed him that if he could get Sir George in the proper state of mind, it would be, perhaps, better that he should know that the Vampire was in the house, and in such a state of mind as not to renew any outrages against him or his family, than that he should go abroad with the dread clinging to him of still being followed and persecuted by that dreadful being. "Sir George," said Mr. Bevan, in an extremely serious voice, "Sir George, did you ever reason with yourself calmly and seriously, and in a Christian spirit, about this affair?" "Calmly, Mr. Bevan! How could I reason calmly?" "I have scarcely put my question as I ought. What I meant to ask was, what are your personal feelings towards the Vampire? We must recollect that even he, dreadful existence as he is, was fashioned by the same God that fashioned us; and who shall say but he may be the victim of a horrible and stern necessity? Who shall say but he may be tortured by remorse, and that the circumstances connected with your daughter, of which you so justly complain, may be to him sources of the bitterest reflection? What if you were to be assured that never more would that mysterious man cross your path, if man we can call him? Do you think that you could then forgive him? It is hard to say, but the feeling that my other child was safe would prompt me much. Sir George, I could make a communication to you if I thought you would listen to it patiently, if you will swear to me to be calm." "I swear! Tell me, oh, tell me!" "The Vampire is in this house." End of chapter 228.